that all that we do will be not just informative, but also edifying and inspiring, as you've called us to be right here, right now, as a source of light and a source of love, a source of hope and a source of truth in the midst of a society and culture that is just unraveling before our very eyes. We face great, great challenges, unlike challenges that any previous generation of American Christians have had to face. And we want to be good and faithful servants. So prepare us to be effective witnesses for you in every area of our lives. And we ask this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Well, I'm going to transition over to the PowerPoint presentation, pretty much where we ended up last week, and we'll take it from there. And we'll finish this this book, C.S. Lewis on Politics, Government, and the Good Society, this evening, and perhaps be able to move on a little bit beyond that as well. But let me go ahead and share the screen here. And we'll get right into our study. It reset back to the beginning. So how's this for a quick review? And if you're a speed reader, you'll have no problem with this. Any questions so far? I don't know why it reset, but so I'm sure if you've missed the session, I'm sure you're taking all this in. All right, and we'll get back to where we left off very quickly here. Yeah, there you go.
How do you say that guy's name?
Jay Budiashevsky. Yeah, yeah. We made the point last week that C.S. Lewis, even though a lot of Christians who've read a lot of his literature don't realize how much he commented on social, cultural, political issues, but around Oxford, he was known as a political sophisticate. In fact, he actually taught history courses occasionally there at Oxford. Of course, we know him as a philosopher and all primarily. He defines himself as a traditionalist, not necessarily a modern, laissez-faire capitalistic conservative necessarily, not a libertarian, certainly, not a Democrat, small d Democrat, not a Christian socialist. And we talked about the major influences on his political beliefs. Of course, scripture primarily, but also various political ideologies that sort of sharpen and refine some of his beliefs. All right, so I think we're getting close to where we should start. Now, we ended up last week with his comments in his Space Trilogy books, Two Threats to Western Civilization. Now, keep in mind, he's writing this about 70 years ago or so. And he's saying that one of the great challenges to Western civilization is the misuse of technology. And what he's taken to task is what he would call an amoral, in other words, morality means nothing to these people, an amoral scientific and technological industrial complex. We've all heard of the military industrial complex. Well, he talked about a scientific and technological industrial complex based on secular humanistic values. And if you've read his Space Trilogy and some of his other works, it's interesting that the chief villain in these novels is always a scientist, by the way. And we commented on that. And the dangers of technology. Of course, now we've entered into the AI dimension and all the challenges that presents as well. Now, he also, though, focuses in his writings on the problems of global socialism or a world welfare state. We've had politicians that have referred to the New World Order and that sort of thing. Well, that's precisely what Lewis was warning against 70 or so years ago. And by that, he's talking about a secular socialist New World Order or globalism in which people's lives are controlled by the government. Now, you've seen, over the course of the last several decades, how the government, primarily when Democrats are in control, the Democratic Party wants to control more and more aspects of our life. And this is precisely what Lewis is warning against. An increasing proportion of the citizenry is dependent upon government for basic needs and desires. Now, if you're dependent on government for basic needs and desires, you're going to continue to vote for those politicians that want to expand the welfare state. And so it's a terrible trap to enter into. But of course, we lurched into this beginning in the early 1930s to try and assuage the problems associated with Great Depression. Then in the 1960s, with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program and all. And from there on, it's just been onward and upward in terms of government regulation and control over so much of our lives. And as I say, this is a factor in the open borders policies of the EU and the United States as well, as we are just being swamped by, undocumented illegal aliens coming into America. Oftentimes, the main draw, of course, is the very, very generous welfare benefits that they'll receive. Now, as far as I'm aware, the United States has the most liberal immigration policies, legal immigration policies in the world. The last I checked, if I remember correctly, we allow about 1 million people into the United States every year on a legal basis, which is incredibly huge number. And then, of course, we're being swamped by millions and millions more illegal aliens coming in as well. And rest assured, they will vote for the party that's in power that doesn't try to control all that illegal immigration. All right, so with that, we want to transition to this section of the book, Ruminations on the Good Society. So we realize that human beings are flawed, all human institutions are flawed, but some are far better than others. So what are C.S. Lewis's ideas in terms of what would constitute a relatively good society? So we'll talk about that. Now, in Mere Christianity, Book 3, there's a chapter entitled Social Morality. And the theme of that chapter is how natural law concepts would influence and regulate the social and the political systems in a harmonious, well-functioning, healthy society. Now, that takes us back a couple of weeks, a couple of sessions ago when we devoted so much time and attention to the principles of natural law, not to be confused with natural physical laws that govern the universe. When we use that term natural law in philosophy, we're talking about natural moral principles that most all civilizations have acknowledged to some extent or another, going all the way back to the advent of civilization. Lewis writes that our society and culture do not determine our values. So the fact that you're born in America or you're born in India or you're born, in Kenya or someplace like that doesn't necessarily dictate or determine what you believe, but they do condition or influence our sensibilities. And since that's clearly the case, we want a society and culture that is as moral based and ethically based as possible, because all of that does have a profound influence on people. It doesn't necessarily dictate what they believe and how they live their lives, but it oftentimes strongly influences that. Aristotle put it this way in ancient Greece: moral principles are learned from those around us who serve as exemplars. Now, hopefully, those are, quality parents. But increasingly, especially in a high-tech society, we also imbibe these principles and values and beliefs and priorities from our society, from popular culture, and technological mediums as well. Now, like Aristotle, Lewis believed it was difficult for individuals to develop virtuous lives apart from a relatively virtuous society. Now, there are exceptions. There are those rare people who grow up in a horrible society and culture, and yet, by God's grace, they're attuned to and committed to following natural law principles and even Christian biblical principles. But people like that are relatively rare. Now, he talks here about the Bible and government. And one thing that we need to make absolutely clear today is that we are not Christian sacralists, or we're not Christian nationalists. We're not theocrats. And we've talked about this before, how the best that we can do in terms of governmental laws and policies is upholding the basic principles of natural law, which are standards that any human being should be held to account for. Don't defraud people in business transactions. Obviously, don't injure other people. Laws against just basic moral principles like that. And so those are principles that apply to all of humanity. Now, as Christians, however, we're called to a much higher level of moral and ethical living and thinking. But those are values that we really cannot impose on other people. And Lewis understands this, as in our next book, Francis Schaeffer, he emphasized this point as well. So this is all related to how we look at the Bible and the proper role of government. And Lewis would argue that the social and political cultures in which the Old and New Testaments were written were radically different from modern times, to say the least. A good society, he would argue, is not a theocratic or sacralistic society. Sacralism is usually this concept that we associate with the union of church and state, or the unholy alliance of church and state. And anytime you have an official state religion, it is going to be unholy and dictatorial, and basically just a servant of the state. It's always worked like that in human history. So we're not talking about imposing some kind of theocracy in America. We're not talking about what the popular term today is Christian nationalism. That should not be our goal. It goes by other terms such as Christian Reconstructionism, theonomy, dominionism, and so on. But again, that should not be our goal. No union of church and state. We want to live in a free society, which is such a blessing, because what that means is that those whose hearts are attuned to God are relatively open and free to live their lives accordingly. And that is the ideal. Now, that also means, of course, any society that celebrates freedom also is a society that oftentimes can be exploited by people who, just want to practice, the most immoral, libertine values. I remember going into a record store many years ago back. Does anybody remember there used to be these things called records? Yeah. Oh, yeah, they spun around 33 1/3 RPMs per minute. So what's that? Black CDs. Okay. Big black CDs. Yes. What's a CD, by the way? I think those have gone the way of the proverbial dinosaur as well. But I went into a record store and I was browsing through the record bins, and I was just kind of picking through, and I came to came to one album that caught my attention. I took it out and looked at it, and it was an album. I can't even remember the name of the group. They were, I guess, notoriously repulsive. And the name of the album was As Nasty as We Want to Be. Does anybody remember that? So that had quite an impact, because what it did was really punctuate so many people's idea of freedom and liberty. Freedom and liberty means I can be as nasty as I want to be. And that's the great thing about America, according to people like that. So I was just really struck by that. And it of course, put so much of the social degradation, in our society, put it so well into perspective. And gosh, that must have been at least 30 years ago. But as nasty as we want to be. But again, with freedom, no, it would have been, the early 90s or whatever, I think. But
1989, and it was put out by the Miami group, Too Loud Group.
oh, thanks for that information. So Paul just informed us that that album was produced in 1989 by some group called Two Live Crew. Okay. Well, again, it just epitomized so many people's idea of freedom and liberty. We would find it absolutely revolting and repulsive, but that's many people's concept. But nonetheless, living in a free society also allows us to serve God as wholeheartedly and unrestrictedly as possible as well. And that's a great, blessing, a great benefit. So C.S. Lewis put it this way in terms of what today is oftentimes called Christian nationalism or theocracy or whatever. He wrote that theocracy is the very worst of all possible governments. And if you look historically, there's a good case to be made for that. So we have to make it very, very clear as Christians, that is not our goal. That's not our agenda. He goes on to write in Christian Apologetics, an essay that he wrote in 1945, theology teaches us what ends are desirable and what means are lawful, while politics teaches what means can be effective. Okay. Good government operates on the basis of natural law principles, and the goal is a good society, not a, quote, Christian society. Because as we know, Christendom, what we collectively refer to as Christendom, was the status quo for over 1,000 years in European history. And what it largely did was destroy the credibility of the Christian faith, because it provided a cloak and a cover for some of the most outrageously unjust political systems and rulers and so on. So what we want is a good society that is well governed by moral law principles, but we're not pushing for a so-called Christian society. Now, what about the issue of New Testament Christian socialism? Now, I know that's a term that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, but frankly, I don't know of a much better term for it. The New Testament does put forth principles for church governance and for church church interactions that you could call socialistic. Acts 2:44 and Acts 4:32 to 35, we read that all the believers were together and had everything in common. People were selling property and all, and distributing the proceeds for the benefit of others in the church and so on. 2 Corinthians 8:13-14, where Paul writes to the Corinthian church, which was a fairly well-to-do church, by the way. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you're hard pressed. He was telling them that, he was collecting money for another church in Greece, but that there might be equality. My guess is you never heard a sermon on that. Our desire is not that others may be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. There are Christians who are destitute, is what he's saying, and we need to be very responsive to people like that. 1 Thessalonians 4:11-12 says, make it your ambition to live a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands, so that your daily life may win the respect of others, and so that you will not be dependent on other people. And then, of course, the famous verse in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. So in other words, even though you might say there were some, quote, socialistic concepts embedded in the Christian church early on, it was not to the point where we allow people to be irresponsible. And so a very clear distinction is made in that respect. But throughout church history, and certainly since, in the last 150 years of American Christian history, there have been those who will argue that true Christianity is socialistic Christianity. But of course, a lot of that depends on exactly how they define that and what policies they believe, will implement such a system. Now note that New Testament Christian socialism was voluntary. So in other words, as Christians, we need to be attentive to the needs of others. And I know so many Christians who are exactly that, very attentive to the needs of others and very responsive to that. But it's all based on a voluntary basis. It's not coercive. So we're not talking about government imposed socialism. We're talking about Christian socialism, or whatever term you want to substitute for the word socialism. New Testament Christian socialism has absolutely nothing in common with mandatory government-imposed redistribution of wealth via confiscatory taxation. Okay. Now, one of so many examples we could cite currently would be the Biden administration, and it is determined to cancel student loans. And I think most of us understand just how fallacious that whole concept is, that American taxpayers, including millions of Americans who went to college and over a period of years paid off their student loan, now they're being taxed so that the Biden administration can cancel student loans and, basically buy the votes of a whole new generation of college students. How unjust, how unfair, how despicable can that possibly be? So that has nothing to do with the concept of Christian socialism as it's been applied sporadically throughout Christian history. Now, what about, again, a similar concept that's oftentimes put forth by those on the left? What about social justice, their idea of social justice Christianity? Now, there's never been a book in all of human history that was written that emphasized social justice more than the Bible. But of course, the way that term is used today is oftentimes absolutely opposite of the social justice that we read about in Scripture. We cannot impose New Testament social and economic values on mainstream society. In order to do that, we would have to have an all-powerful coercive government. Christian moral, social, and economic values are for the community of Christ. Mainstream society, obviously, is not Christian. Like Puritans and fundamentalists in the past who attempted to regulate the private lives of Christians and non-Christians, left-wing Christians today want to use the power of government to enforce their idea of social justice. But basically, what they're advocating for is nothing but a pseudo-Christian form of Marxism, Marxist socialism. In fact, liberation theology, which is an attempt to mix Marxism and Christianity, liberation theology is a perversion of true Christianity. Liberation theology is far more Marxist than it is Christian, of course. Now, so just some basic comments on Christian socialism and social justice, and how that those terms and those concepts have been twisted and distorted, and I think perverted in our time under the guise of being Christian, when in fact they're more Marxist than they are truly Christian. Okay. Oh, we have several comments that have come in via chat, so let me check with those before we move on. Can you type it, the Watchman? Yes, Janet, your question there, can you type it, the Watchman? Yes, Millie Atkinson's newsletter is called The Watchman, and the yeah, how's that accessed?
She can just send an email. Millie will send out the Watchman just like she has.
Okay.
The domain thing, the way it works, you have to have that.
Right. Okay.
She's basically a mass marketer.
Okay. Yeah. So just contact. So if you're not already on the Watchman email list, just let Millie know, or you can even send an inquiry to the areopagus.org, and we'll get you on that.
No, I'm on the email list. I just thought you mentioned she had a website now.
She doesn't have a website. She has a domain.
She has a domain. I think I misspoke and said that she had a website. Okay.
C. Atkinson at gmail.com, which I'm sure Janet already has.
Yeah, Millie C. Atkinson at gmail.com. Let's see. I think that's all of the responses that have come in. All right, so let's move on here to now we've talked about Lewis's views on Christianity and socialism. Let's take a look at some comments he makes regarding what he would term the good society and modern conservatism. Paul, you had a comment, I think, before we.
First, okay, regarding Christian socialism, that was only done in the church. It doesn't apply to society as a whole. It was done in a church, actually, not even the church. And so, and in today's world with more persecution coming on, I could actually see us doing something like that again, where we might have to look out for each other in a church and take care of each other if people lose their jobs or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say that when
but it's all voluntary, isn't it? And that's what's so fundamentally different from government imposed socialism.
Yes. In the Colson Fellows program, they have to read the book by Thaddeus Williams, professor at Biola, called Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. And the basic argument as he goes through different sections is that Christian social justice is a reconciliatory process process, whereas, as you said, social justice, he calls it social justice A and B. A is Christian, B is Marxist. And the Marxist one, of course, is to create opposition between oppressors and the oppressed.
Yeah, it's all based on the Marxist, the simplistic Marxist interpretation of all of history. Yeah. So the title of the book, Paul, that you are mentioning here, and confronting injustices
Singular, without compromising truth.
Without compromising truth, and the author is Thaddeus Williams. Okay, thank you. And there's a lot of books out like that, but this one's endorsed by the Colson Center, so it probably is a very quality book. All right, now let's take a look at Lewis's critique, though, regarding modern conservatism. Now, this is modern conservatism as he understood it, of course, in British society. So there's a lot of correlations with, modern conservatism in American society as well, but not totally direct. Lewis would describe himself, as we said in our last session, as a traditionalist rather than a, quote, conservative. His concept of the good society incorporates many traditional and conservative principles. Okay, but we have to be very cautious when we're in conversation with other people, describing ourselves as, yes, I believe in traditional values and this sort of thing, because remember, traditional values in the minds of many people, that means, for instance, sexism, that women are second-class, people and second-class citizens. There's also an awful lot of racism embedded in traditional values as well. So we have to be very, very cautious using terms like this, and try to explain what we mean as carefully as possible. Now, as a Christian and somebody who has a very realistic understanding of human nature, for better and for worse, Lewis is certainly not a libertarian. We made that point a couple of weeks ago. A good society, he says, while protecting individual freedom within all the proper parameters, would not promote immorality, hedonism, materialism, and irresponsible behavior and lifestyles. And of course, there are many who would term themselves libertarians today. And we might share a lot of common values with these people on a lot of issues. On the other hand, libertarians oftentimes are those who believe there should be absolutely no laws against, no restrictions on abortion, on drug usage, on pornography, all of these things, which hopefully we would find absolutely repulsive. So we need to be cautious about that. So a good society, while protecting individual freedom within proper parameters, does not promote immorality, hedonism, materialism, irresponsible behavior and lifestyles. Social and cultural institutions should strive, according to Lewis, to cultivate healthy values based on the golden rule and the cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues, as you see there, of prudence and temperance and justice and fortitude and so on. A good society would promote many what we would call conservative values. For instance, the values associated with natural law, traditional morals and manners in most respects, traditional family values, respect for elders, respect for those in authority, at least to the extent that they are worthy of respect, those in authority, individual responsibility. And again, as he would put it, in a good society, there would be no passengers and no parasites. In other words, everybody, is self-supporting and independent in that regard to the fullest extent of their abilities. So just society taking care of people that are irresponsible and all, he would say, absolutely, that's not just in any way. And yet we've seen over the last 60 or more years, especially, that that's become just absolutely habitual in American society. Oh, FDR's comments on social welfare. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, came in and under the guise of trying to rectify a faltering economy during the depths of the Great Depression. FDR began initiating programs that were at least mildly socialistic, but he does say on one occasion in one of his major speeches that the government cannot and should not continue to provide welfare. He says that's a very dangerous path to go down. Now, how serious he was, how honest he was in saying that is questionable. But nonetheless, he did say it again in one of his major speeches. And that was certainly the general consensus back in those days, that you can't support other people to the point where they lose the capacity or the desire to be supporting and responsible themselves. Yes, Chuck?
On your last slide, you had 4 points. Temperance, justice, truthful.
Mhm.
Where is temperance just important? Thank you.
Yeah, those are referred to as the cardinal virtues.
So how do you define 4
Courage.
courage?
Yeah, basically courage, the courage of one's convictions. Uh-huh.
All right, thank you.
Uh-huh. Now, another issue that he opens up, not just Lewis, but other great thinkers in the 20th century as well, other great moral thinkers, and that is the concept of good work. In other words, is our role in life as serious Christians, is it just to have a job, or is it to have a job that in some way or another contributes to the well-being of not only our own family, but society in general? So that's the concept of good work that he's emphasizing. And he puts it this way: everyone's work should be to produce something good, not just something, but something good. In other words, something of true value. This is something we really, need to emphasize to children and grandchildren. And that is, no, you don't go into a career just to make as much money as you possibly can. You want to contribute something worthwhile to society. There would be, he says, no manufacture of silly luxuries. I think we have a few of those in our society, don't we? Silly luxuries. And even sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. So Lewis is making a very strong moral point here that oftentimes is just totally overlooked. And that is, no, we're here to be a source of goodness, and justice and all. And let's don't contribute to the very worst impulses in our society. E.F. Schumacher, in his book, Good Work, I read this back in college, and boy, it was really impactful. I think it was written around 1971 or something like that. And Schumacher says there's basically 3 purposes of human work. One is to provide necessary and useful goods and services. Second is to enable everyone to use and perfect their gifts as good stewards. And thirdly, to do so in service to and in cooperation with others so as to liberate ourselves from our inborn egocentrism. So I think 3 principles that are very, very worthy of serious attention and consideration. E.F. Schumacher, Good Work. So again, going back to the issue of socialism, Lewis says in some respects, a good society would be, quote, socialistic, if you want to use that term, a society based on cooperation rather than cutthroat competition, a charitable society based on the common good or the general welfare, which is, of course, an element of traditional moral law. A society, he also adds, that rejects usury. Now, what is usury?
Interest.
Okay, excessive interest. Yes. And remember that ancient Israel, which was supposed to have been a theocratic state, remember in the Old Testament, or at least parts of the Old Testament, usury was prohibited. And so was usury supposedly prohibited in medieval Europe, which was supposed to be the domain of Christendom. So if you don't try to exploit those who are in need, and you can loan them money, but then you turn around and charge excessive interest. If you as, let's say, if you as a Christian would not do that, who else might? Well, the Jews, uh-huh. And this was one of those stereotypes of Jews throughout the Middle Ages and into modern times as well, that they were exploiters of others in society. Okay. So Lewis is basically addressing that issue. Now, socialism oftentimes is rooted in class conflict, which of course was a fundamental tenet of Marxism. John Adams put it this way: in every society where property exists, there's always going to be a struggle between the rich and the poor. Unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that. See, now, Karl Marx is highly overrated, to say the least, but he did contribute one significant factor to human history, Western history, and that is the economic factor. He said that history is oftentimes driven by materialistic, by economic concerns. And now he totally blew it all out of proportion and overemphasized it. But prior to Marx, very few historians even emphasized that point. So he was right to an extent, say. And but yet, like I said, I mean, he used that principle, of course, to propose a system of government that would be, again, totally, authoritarian and exploitative. But here we have one of our America's founding fathers, John Adams, saying essentially the same thing, because it's true. In every society where property exists, there's always going to be a struggle between the rich and the poor. James Madison, not exactly a communist, writes, the most common source of conflict has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Here's the Working Men's Republican Political Association of 1835. Now, this was not the Republican Party that later emerged in the 1850s. This was just some kind of local political organization in Pennsylvania. But look at what this organization writes, quote, there appear to exist two distinct classes, the rich and the poor, the oppressed and the oppressor. Now, again, this is 15 years before Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and it was about 35 years before Marx wrote Das Kapital. But there appear to exist two distinct classes, the rich and the poor, the oppressed and the oppressor. Those that live by their own labor and those that live by the labor of others exploit other people. The aristocratic and the democratic, small d democratic, the despotic and the republican, who are in direct opposition to one another in their objects and pursuits. So again, this is a reality that needs to be, acknowledged in world history. Now, with Marx, of course, he's going to exploit this concept of the rich and the poor, the oppressors and the oppressed, and the issue of class conflict in order to promote his ideal society, a communist society. And this is what he writes in the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Okay, well, class struggle is a factor, but he's trying to make it the sole dominating factor. And in that sense, he's totally wrong. Society as a whole, he says, is more and more splitting up into two hostile camps, into two great classes facing one another: the bourgeoisie, or what we would call kind of the well-to-do class in society, and the proletariat, the working class. He goes on to say, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. Now, my favorite quote from Karl Marx comes from another source, in which Karl Marx said, and he's commenting on European society, British society, German society, and all in general. And he writes that everything that exists needs to be destroyed. And he's talking about everything about Western civilization, including, by the way, the Christian influences in Western civilization need to be destroyed so that we can begin fresh and anew and build a truly communistic, society. So everything that exists needs to die, basically, is what he wrote. And is that not the mentality that we see in operation today among the radical left in American politics and throughout Western society in general? Everything associated with Western civilization, including our rich tradition of the rule of law, also the Christian influences in Western civilization, all that needs to die. So we can, emphasis on the nuclear family and all that needs to be destroyed so we can build, a new and more perfect communistic society.
Does he call that creative destruction?
Yeah, he does use that term. Yeah. So in other words, it's not destroying everything about the past just out of rage, although there's a lot of rage involved here, but it's in order to create a better, more just society.
Well, you can't introduce the new world order without first
destroying the old. And they are succeeding brilliantly, aren't they? Okay, he goes on to say that, so communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social political order of things. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians, the working class, have nothing to lose but their chains. They're just being exploited by their employers and the upper class in general. They have a world to win. And of course, he ends the Communist Manifesto: working men of all countries unite. Okay. So it really plays on a lot of the class conflict, the inherent conflict between those who are in the lower echelons of a society and those in the upper echelons. And it really sets these two groups against one another. But it's not to make for a better, more just society and world, not at all. It's to overthrow the existing order so that the socialist elite, like Karl Marx, can take over and control things. Well, we looked at socialism in the early church, Acts 2. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to everyone as he had need. But again, remember, this is all voluntary. Now, the most generous people in the world are Christians who understand that, this is an element of Christian discipleship, to help one another. But again, it's all based on our fellowship of Jesus Christ, not the motives that the left would want to impose. Acts 4, all the believers were of one heart and mind. Nobody claimed that his possessions were his own, but they shared everything that they had. 2 Corinthians 8:14, our desire is not that others may be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there may be equality. 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 and 12. Make it your ambition to live a quiet life, to mind your own business, work with your hands, so that your daily life will win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anyone. And then again, the verse we read a while ago, 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 and 10. Keep away from every brother who is idle, irresponsible. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. Okay. Other aspects of socialism in the early church. The Apostle Paul advocates voluntary, spirit-led justice, discipleship, based on self-sacrificial or agape love. New Testament Christian, quote, socialism has nothing in common with confiscatory taxation and mandatory government-imposed redistribution of wealth. In Screwtape Proposes a Toast, one of the last pieces that Lewis wrote in his life, you see there, 1959, that was attached, by the way, after he had already written the Screwtape Letters 10 or 15 years earlier. And he added this to the book. So if you ever buy that book, the Screwtape Letters, make sure it has this appendix to it. Screwtape Proposes a Toast. And in that, Lewis writes, quote, 19th century Christian socialism posed the greatest threat to the kingdom of darkness in this world. Actually, for time's sake, I'm not going to be able to comment sufficiently on that, but his point is the next one, and that is that the socialist ideal was co-opted and perverted by secular authoritarians. So again, if you go back and read that in context in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, it's very clear he's not talking about secular government imposed socialism, but the concept rather that we were talking about earlier, and how that there were many Christians, especially in the 19th century, early 20th century, who were really advocating, if you want to call it mild socialism, we needed to be concerned with the welfare of others, not just ourselves, and we needed to be as open and giving and tolerant as possible when it came to sharing our resources with others. That's basically what he's saying there. But you see that it was co-opted, the socialist ideal was co-opted and perverted by secular authoritarians. So what about socialism? Well, contemporary secular socialism, that's what you get in the British Labour Party. That's also what you get in the Democratic Party in the United States. A Marxist influenced agenda that's based on not biblical, but neo-Marxist, quote, social justice, government controlled redistribution of wealth, DEI, we all know about that, diversity, equity, and inclusion. CRT, critical race theory, is an element of this. And ESG, of course, environment, social, and corporate governance. And you have all these corporations that are being assessed and rated according to their ESG scores and all. All right, some other points about socialism. Socialism depends upon coercive government that functions on the basis of confiscatory taxation, the confiscation of people's income, and forced redistribution of wealth. Socialist governments strictly regulate economic systems and relationships, social institutions, and the lives of their citizens. So, we can read Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm. We can read Huxley's Brave New World, or 1984. And oh my, those works were written, what, 50, 75, 80 years ago. And we're seeing those horrifying books being manifest and all today. Socialists have a utopian and unrealistic view of human nature. We've talked about that. You know, any good government has to be predicated on a realistic assessment of human behavior. So we don't want authoritarian, totalitarian government that tries to regulate and control every aspect of our lives, but also we need moral laws and the enforcement of moral laws. So neither libertarianism nor socialism or communism are the ideal, to say the least. Socialists have a simplistic understanding of social and economic history. I write a lot more about that in my book, American Crisis. Socialism puts the economic cart before the horse. What's the purpose of an economic system? Well, it's to produce, manufacture and produce useful goods and services, right? That's the purpose of an economic system. Now, the distribution of wealth, that's a secondary issue. But we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. And what socialism tries to do, it's all about the equal and so-called just distribution of wealth. And yet what it does is paralyze and oftentimes destroy the production and manufacture of useful goods and services. So that's the point there. Socialistic centralized economic planning does not work. You know, when you have these professional bureaucrats in Washington and every, you know, state capital and whatever that are trying to control the economy of a state or a nation, you find out what a sham and potentially what a disaster that can be. Socialism promotes individual irresponsibility and dependency. And you probably saw in the news just recently interviews with numerous illegal immigrants coming across the border. And who do you prefer, Biden or Trump? Well, it's 100% who they prefer. Yeah. Socialism also promotes social injustice. So it's a total lie. I mean, we're talking about, again, government socialism, secular socialism promotes actually social injustice. And, you know, it sounds good in theory. Here's Karl Marx waxing eloquently, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. But that's not at all how it works in the real world. Now, Lewis writes about this in particular in his 1945 book, which was the third book in his space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, in which he warns us that state socialism has a totalitarian impulse. Okay. We don't find that alarming at all today, do we? But again, he's writing this, you know, 80 years ago or whatever. Warning, Great Britain will become, quote, developed and ruined by greedy capitalists who care nothing for its natural beauty and historical heritage. Everything is about the bottom line. It's about money. And so they'll tear up the environment, do anything necessary to make more money off the system. He was adamantly opposed to that mentality. Warning, science and technology run amok. He says the stifling of all deep-set repugnancies, in other words, the stifling of all traditional values, the good traditional values, were the first essential for progress, according to these people. Okay, so it's all about not, when it comes to science and technology, too often it's not about should we develop such and such a new technology or whatever. It's merely can we. See, but the morality of it all is not a factor at all. In an article that he wrote in 1958, an essay called Is Progress Possible? Willing Slaves of the Welfare State. Now, as I mentioned last week, The war in World War II, the war in Europe had only been over a few weeks. Hitler and the Nazis were defeated. Now there was still a war, of course, raging in the Pacific, but the war in Europe was over, and the British people could not wait to get Winston Churchill out of office so they could elect a socialist, a labor candidate, Clement Attlee. And so that's partly what he's reacting against here. He says the theme is that the changing relationship between the government and its citizens, many people willingly sacrifice personal freedom for government guaranteed security. And that's the great attraction of socialism. The future, he tells us, is troubling. The ever-expanding welfare state and the emergence of global technocracy, in other words, technology elites who have an inordinate amount of power and control and influence. And I don't think we have to be convinced of that. The man was truly a prophet in that regard. And this is what he says: I dread government in the name of science. That is how tyrannies come in. Now, you might even think back 3 years ago to how the technocrats and the scientists were handling the COVID crisis here in America and elsewhere. Oh, well, I had forgotten I had added this addendum here. Senator Rand Paul on the COVID fiasco, which Rand Paul writes, over the last few years, public health experts were wrong about almost everything. If we are to avoid these kinds of catastrophes in the future, we need to reform government and rein in out of control scientists and their enablers. Lewis goes on to write, 2 wars necessitated, he's talking about World War I and World War II, necessitated curtailments of liberty. And we have grown accustomed to our chains. The increasing complexity and precariousness of our economic life have forced government to take over many spheres of activity once left to individual choice and chance. As a result, classical political theory has essentially died. And he's talking about what we, generally refer to as classical liberal concepts on which, our government was based and so on. Classical political theory has died. Well, it died, it's been dying more thoroughly in Britain than in America, but we're not very far behind, frankly. Then he also talks about the problem of progressive authoritarian social and political theories. Says true progress means increasing goodness and happiness of individual lives, which requires freedom, but it also requires virtue. And we've talked about that as well, how the founding fathers emphasized liberty, but they always linked it with virtue. Otherwise, liberty turns into libertarianism. Lewis writes, we all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turn, then to continue going forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn, walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive. He had this wonderful, very subtle sense of humor. And I think if you look at the present state of the world, it's pretty plain that humanity has been making some very big mistakes. We are on the wrong road. And if that is so, we must go back. Going back is the quickest way out. Okay. And you might recognize that from your Christianity, of course. The question about progress, he says, has become the question whether we can discover any way of submitting to the worldwide paternalism of technocracy without losing all personal privacy and independence. Again, this is somebody writing more than 60 years ago. And it's, very relevant for today. I believe a man is happier if he has, quote, the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence, which the new society is abolishing. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by the government. And in adult life, it is the mature man who needs and asks nothing of government and can criticize its acts and reject its ideology. Okay. So here's somebody who's adamantly opposed to, the kind of government intervention and control, micromanaging that we've come to pretty much accept in modern America and the West in general. Remember the statement by Lord Acton: power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lewis says, have we discovered some new reason why this time power should not corrupt as it always has before? In other words, have we progressed beyond this basic human characteristic, and that is people lust for power and they're never satiated. They're never, satisfied. And Lewis says, well, apparently human nature hadn't changed any, and we have the same tendencies today. All right, so two manifestations of socialism. We have classical Marxist socialism, such as we encounter in George Orwell's 1984. We have what we would call neo-Marxist, so-called democratic socialism, which is what we encounter in Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. And again, for time's sake, I'm going to have to speed through some of this. So a postscript on all this: valuing society or valuing the state more than human beings. Think about how all these authoritarian, totalitarian regimes in the past, the Nazis, the fascists in Italy under Mussolini, the communists, of course, they don't care about human beings. Human life means nothing to these people. It's all about the state and creating an all-powerful authoritative state. That's their agenda. Lewis puts it this way: if Christianity is true, then the individual, though, is not only more important than the state, but incomparably more important than the state or civilization. For the individual, human beings are everlasting. No government is, no state is. All right, so the summary: why politics and government matter. Politics matters because laws, policies, and the programs of government significantly impact the quality of life for citizens, for better or for worse. So if we love other people like we're enjoined to do, then we have to take politics seriously. It can just totally frustrate people's attempts to live a decent, responsible, God-honoring life. And of course, we've talked about his emphasis on natural law, his political philosophy, his ruminations on the good society. Remember, our mission is not to create a union of church and state, Christian nationalism. Now, anytime Christians get involved in politics, the secularists will immediately think that we're trying to impose, specifically Christian values. And as we were talking about earlier on, that should not be our agenda. We want to live under just laws that apply to everyone. As Christians, we're called to higher standards of living, of course, but those are not standards we can impose on society in general. His critique of socialism, The essence of the Christian faith, well, that's a spiritual relationship with God, isn't it? Through faith in Jesus Christ and the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. But in its fullest dimensions, Christianity is also a comprehensive worldview, as Francis Schaeffer, emphasized what he would call oftentimes the Lordship of Jesus Christ over the whole of life. So the problem with Christian piety, and we've got just a few more minutes here, I think we can finish up. The problem of Christian pietism is the idea that all that matters is the gospel. Well, what's the most important thing in life? Yes, it's the gospel, isn't it? Okay, but the most important thing is not the only thing. And so oftentimes for evangelicals, it's a cop-out. We'll focus on the gospel, evangelism, and so on exclusively. Whereas if you truly love someone else, then you're concerned about the quality of the society and culture in which they live, because it has a very direct impact on our lives. So politics is messy and unspiritual and divisive. Yes, that's all true. But again, that's not an escape clause for us being ignorant and uninvolved in the political affairs of our lives. Jesus is asked, which is the greatest commandment? As you know, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love others as you love yourself. We cannot truly love ourselves and others if we don't care about the kind of society and culture, laws, and public policies that regulate our lives. They can be extremely repressive. How can we possibly love others unless we're sensitive and attentive not only to their spiritual and religious lives, but also their physical well-being? Think about, children, grandchildren, and so on, or a spouse. And you can't love anybody else unless you're attentive to certainly their spiritual life, their religious life, their church involvement, and so on. But also, we have to be attentive to their physical needs, don't we? Their material needs, their social needs, their mental, intellectual needs, their psychological, and their creative needs as well. So Christian discipleship is a holistic calling. First principle of responsible citizenship, politics is mostly about damage control. There aren't any perfect politicians out there, to say the least. There are no perfect systems of government. But what we want to do is keep the very worst people with the very worst ideas out of public office. So I realize there's a lot of elections when that come up, and you're not impressed with either candidate. I won't be more specific than that. But our calling is to keep the very worst, who has the very worst agenda, out of office. Even, as we often say, even if you have to go in and hold your nose when you vote, it's frankly irresponsible, and I'd say immoral, not to vote accordingly. Okay, one of these two characters is going to win, and their policies and programs are vastly different. Personality-wise, that's a burden to bear, isn't it? But nonetheless, there is a difference, and we need to be very clear about that. Oh, okay. I'll check with that in just a moment here. For Christians, the main thing is the salvation of souls. Of course, that's the most important. But the main thing is not the only thing. And as Jesus put it, give to the government what rightly belongs to the government, and no more, by the way, and to God the things that are God's. We should care deeply about the kind of society and culture in which we and others live. To ignore the political implications of holistic Christian discipleship is unfaithful and irresponsible. We are living in a free, at least, our heritage is as a free nation. And it is irresponsible not to be well informed, actively engaged in the great issues of our time. So let me close this out. Our calling as a countercultural watchmen is no excuse from active involvement in the great moral ethical battles that are raging. Lewis cared about politics and government because political systems, laws, and policies can either help or hinder us in realizing our God-given purpose and potential in life. So here's the bottom line. In that regard, we need to be well informed. We need to be vigilant. We need to be active in terms of exposing and defeating those politicians whose agendas pose the greatest threat to what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. So we have, for instance, here in America, two very imperfect political parties. But having said that, there is a vast difference in those two political parties and what they represent. We have a moral imperative to actively support and promote principles, policies, and programs that contribute to human flourishing and all for the glory of God. And we'll end with this famous quote from Edmund Burke: all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men and women do nothing. So let's don't do nothing, okay? And again, we realize there's never an ideal choice, but invariably one is better than the others, and sometimes one is far better than the other alternative, perhaps despite the personalities of the two people who are running. So let me check with our chat here, and then we'll close things out. Yes, bad politics allowed Laken Riley to be murdered by an illegal alien who's committed multiple crimes and bashed her soul in with blunt trauma, causing the police spokesman to
It meant to say he was emotional when he read the details.
I'm sorry, Janet, but
The spokesman got very emotional when he had to read the details of how bad her
yeah,
skull damage was.
yes. And of
And
course,
that's because we have bad politics happening right now. Open borders, that's not the law of the land.
absolutely.
Yet we have an administration allowing chaos and crime to just happen everywhere. And we're inviting it in.
You're absolutely correct, obviously, about that. And so it's very, very sobering. She was very highly respected by so many friends, people who knew her. Presumably she was a Christian. At least that's what many talked about, was her Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
And it was totally irresponsible on the part of our governing officials that this murderer was let into the country. And of course, we have all this crime being committed, you know, and lack of, just total breakdown of law and order by both American citizens and illegals coming into the country. And there's just absolutely no justification for all of this chaos that we see happening all around us each and every day. So as Christians, we need to be well informed and proactive. And again, the two choices, their personalities and whatever, may not be ideal, but it's the bottom line. It's all about policies and programs and priorities, isn't it? Not really personalities, although we would like to have somebody whose character and personality we can respect. Yes, please.
Well, like you said, it's all purposeful, because in order to bring about the new world order, the old world order has to be destroyed. So
Yes,
law and order,
yes.
the rule of law has to be destroyed in order for the new world order to come in. So we're just witnessing, that's just an example of it.
Yeah. So we're just being overrun with people, both American citizens and people coming in, who apparently hate most everything on which America was founded. And
Well, and there's something wrong that the university or that area is a sanctuary city.
yes, Athens is a so-called sanctuary city as well. They have a DA who apparently has been extremely soft on crime. And obviously that just invites more and more chaos. And yeah, it puts students in jeopardy. Yes, absolutely. No, no. Bad behavior that's not, corrected or addressed is just going to generate more and more bad behavior. So. The mayor of Athens said. Said the person who was responsible was the perpetrator, not the fact that Athens is a so-called sanctuary city. Yeah. The city had nothing to do with it, according to this mayor. Well, that's why we need drastically better leadership. So, well,
Yeah, and
listen,
he tried to deny it, just to let you know. And so someone had 2020 video of him welcoming illegals into the city and declaring them to be a sanctuary city. So he actually tried to deny it, but video, exposed him for his lie.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to be real blunt about it, I mean, we have a lot of people in positions of leadership and authority in America today who are moral morons. And so they're just contributing, in fact, sponsoring, you might even say, the breakdown of our society. So let's be wise about this and do everything possible to keep the very worst people with the very worst beliefs and policies out of office. And we must do that if we truly love others and want them to live in a decent, civil society. So, well, I know that's an awful lot to take in this evening. It was actually a little bit more than I envisioned. But anyway, we're finished with that book on C.S. Lewis. Now, we'll take up the Francis Schaeffer book. I'm going to limit that to just 2 of our sessions next week and the following week. And then after that, we'll go directly into Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. And so very much looking forward to continuing. Good to see you all, both online and here in person as well. Have a wonderful week, and let's truly be a source of all that is, let's be a source of light and love and hope and truth in the midst of a society that desperately needs all of that. So thank you. Blessings.